Hello and welcome. It's Friday already. Hard to believe it's already here, but it is the end of the week and you're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Remember, I'm hosting Coast to Coast AM tonight and tomorrow night. You can find stations in your area simply by visiting coasttocoastam.com and then click on the stations tab. You'll find every station around the world that offers it, including XM Sirius. How you can listen, all that information is right there. So make sure you go check it out. Tonight we're going to be talking about classic TV, one of the masterminds behind shows like The Bionic Woman, V, Alien Nation, and so many other great programs. So we're going to talk with him tonight on Coast to Coast. Tomorrow we're going to take a trip down true crime lane as we look at Soaked in Bleach. What happened when Kurt Cobain committed suicide? Was it truly a suicide, or is there a more nefarious underpinning to this? We're going to find out tomorrow when we talk to the director and producer of Soaked in Bleach. And he's bringing along a guest that's going to help us really look into the details of this case for all 4 hours of Coast to Coast plus your phone calls. That's tomorrow right on Coast to Coast AM. You'll find all the information. Remember, you can always stream it from, KNSIRadio.com. KNSIRadio.com. That's the best way to check it out and keep up with us. Timmy D will be back with me on Monday, and we will begin a new Parashare and Supernatural News. So let's get started tonight. It's been a long time, I think nearly 10 years since we've had this guest on with us, and it's great to have him back. American Hauntings, the rise of the spirit world, and the birth of the modern ghost hunter. Troy Taylor is with us this evening. Troy, welcome back to the show.
Hey, man, I think it's been longer than that. Honestly, I was thinking about it today, and I thought, I was trying to remember where I lived the last time I talked to you, and I could swear it's been like 15, 18 years. I'm not kidding. It's been a long time.
Well, our show's only been on the air for 11 and a half years, so I don't think it's been that long.
Then maybe it hasn't been that long. So,
right.
Well, it all starts to blur after a while.
Tell me, I know about it. 50's coming up quick this year, and everything past 2 weeks ago is a blur to me. Well, it's either way, it's great to have you back. I know you were not doing radio interviews for a while, and it's good to have you back with us.
Yeah.
This is a great book, and it's a great history lesson for people that are intrigued with the paranormal and kind of getting a good look at the paranormal and where these stories and spiritualism really started, how they, there are some great stories. There are some hoaxes involved throughout history with this, too. What made you decide to come out with this book?
It's something I've been fascinated with it for pretty much forever. I mean, it's some of the stuff that really got me started, interested in the field in the first place. But I think that in the last year or so, kind of the catalyst behind it was just like a couple of things happened. One, I went to see a movie that was, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, based on a true story, and there was nothing about it that was true. And I thought, well, this is bad because people are going to believe this story and realize that none of that really happened. And then I met somebody who was convinced that ghost hunting started in 2004. So, I'm like, okay, no, it didn't start with television shows. I promise. It really didn't. And so that,
obviously, we know that started. It started in 83 with the Ghostbusters, right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. See, that was the beginning of all of it, right?
Obviously.
Yeah. So, I thought, I've toyed around with stuff over the years. I've written about, spiritualism and things that, that happened in the, the early 1900s and the first ghost hunting groups in the 1870s, but I never had really put together like an entire compiled history of this is how it started. This is what influenced it. This is what happened. And, this and all of the close calls that came over the years, we talk about, all the things that we do now and the ghost hunting that we do and the ghost research that's being done. But people don't realize that, we almost didn't have the kind of field that we have if it hadn't have been for certain things that happened in the 1860s. It's that far back, that's what kept this stuff, that's what kept the interest going. So what I tried to do was put together a history of how the paranormal has affected popular culture in American history. I mean, I didn't want it to be like a dry history book. I wanted it to be, this is the stuff that appealed to, everybody, before social media, before television, before radio, before anything. This was the stuff that people were really interested in. These were the fads. I mean, ghosts were just a fad in the 1840s. I mean, nobody thought it would be around for long, and it really wasn't. It almost died out. If it hadn't been for the Civil War, we might not have continued with the interest in spiritualism and ghosts and hauntings and communications with the dead and all that kind of thing that we take for granted now. So that was kind of the idea behind it, was to put all this together in one place.
If we look further back in history, I mean, weren't there, it seems like it's cyclical in nature. The Egyptians certainly had an interest in it, the Mayans, and many different cultures in trying to communicate with our dead. And they've, it's even covered in the Bible, what, a 2,000-year-old book, right, that talks about communication and who has it and who's not able to do it, who should do it, who shouldn't do it. So, I mean, it's always been a part of our culture, and it seems to, rise around wartime, it seems, or times of unease and unrest. What have you found in really kind of digging deep into the history of spiritualism, ghosts, and fascination with it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been, the idea of spirit communication has been with us since the beginning of recorded time, and probably even before that. It just didn't become like a popular fad or part of our culture until America in the late 1840s. Now there had been things before that. There had been things leading up to that. But it wasn't until the Fox sisters and the rappings in Hydesville, New York, where they claimed that they could communicate with, with the ghost that was supposedly haunting the house they were living in. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until that time that it became just such a touchstone for people all over the country. For whatever reason, it was the right time, and it caught on, and people went crazy about it. I mean, they really went bananas about it. I mean, the idea, and people have a hard time understanding just how popular seances and communications became. Last year, I compared it to Pokemon Go. I mean, when everybody was doing it, sure. And not everybody. I mean, I'm assuming you and I probably weren't, but there were a lot of people doing it, and it became this huge fad, and everybody was talking about it. That is exactly what happened in the 1840s. Now, we're talking pre-cell phones, pre-everything. This was at the birth of the telegraph. That's how complex communications were at the time. But spread by newspapers, spread by stories, spread by word of mouth. All across the country, people were going crazy about the idea that they could sit down at a table and talk to their dead relatives. And this went on for a few years. I mean, for about a decade, there were mediums popping up all over the country who claimed that they could communicate with the dead. And this was pre a lot of the fraud that came into it later. That came a little after this. A lot of people started to believe they had gifts. So maybe some did, maybe some didn't. But a lot of people believed they did. But it started to fade out. By the end of the 1850s, the fad was over, just like every other fad in this country that we have seen. I mean, America is a nation of extremes, and people will often talk about, the kinds of things that they'll get excited about, but then it fades away. And that's exactly what happened to spiritualism. And then, like you said, the Civil War came along. Suddenly we had thousands of young men who were dead, who had been killed. And if it had not been for the Civil War and people who now saw spiritualism not just as a fad or something that they could gather in their living rooms to do and, get the ghost and rap on tables or tip things or that kind of thing, now they had a chance to actually talk to the loved ones who were gone, who had died. Well, suddenly this became this was a fad that they had been talking about a few years before, but now everybody was really excited because it had an actual, application. It was something plausible. It was something they could really relate to. And I always credit Abraham Lincoln with sort of saving spiritualism. Between Lincoln and the Civil War, people began to realize just how, really how great this thing was. Lincoln and his wife, married, lost one of their children in the middle of the Civil War. Their son Willie died. And there are a lot of records, and a lot of mainstream historians will say, well, Lincoln may have had an interest in it, but we don't ever know that he participated. Well, there are an awful lot of records that say that he did, where they actually had seances in the White House. Now, this wasn't the first time. There had been other presidents having seances in the White House before Lincoln, but he's who made him popular. And it wasn't just Lincoln, it was mostly Mary, who became obsessed with the idea of talking to their dead son, Willie. And the story spread. I mean, it made the newspapers, people talked about it, and if the president and his wife were doing it, well, then that's okay for us too. It became the common belief. And so, again, spiritualism began to grow in popularity, and it snowballed, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And somewhere along the line, someone realized, hey, what a great way to make money. I can sell my services as a medium, and I can, go around to people and I can help them communicate with their dead relatives, and, it'll only cost them a small amount of money, and that's, of course, once money gets involved, as we know, that's where fraud gets involved, and that's where things got a little sketchy. But spiritualism played a really important role in American history, especially for women, because this was the first job that women could have where they could make their own money. They didn't have to be married. They could actually go out and serve as a medium and make their own money. I mean, this is the first real movement in American history that allowed women to be leaders in what they were doing. A lot of the people who were involved in spiritualism were women, and for the first time, they were accepted in a leadership role. And this was not something that was common in the 1860s, 1870s. Right. It was not something that people normally saw. A lot of things. I remember last year when Hillary Clinton was running for president, people talked about her being the first woman from a major party who was running for president. Now, this was true from a major party, but she wasn't the first woman to run for president. That woman had been a spiritualist medium named Victoria Woodhull. She had been the first woman to ever run for presidential office. And her campaign didn't get very far. She didn't win a lot of votes against President Grant, who at the time was running for re-election, but she was the first woman to run as candidate for president. And I did see that get mentioned, but I noticed that a lot of the reports in USA Today and places like that didn't mention that she was a medium first, that she had practicing spiritualist. But this was something that really changed American history. It changed society, and It changed culture. And it was a movement about ghosts.
Let me ask you something.
It was so popular in the country. Yeah.
Lincoln certainly was popular and beloved, and he was also reviled, and people didn't like him. When word got out that there were seances taking place at the White House, that was still a very religious time in our culture. How did the religious sect deal with that? I mean, was there slander and anger towards Lincoln and his wife for bringing this to politics?
Well, sure. There was anger and about spiritualism in general. I mean, it was it divided the country, completely. Again, it's one of those things where people don't understand just how popular it was. I mean, it really swept the country. I mean, there were millions of practicing spiritualists in the 1850s before before it started to kind of fade before the Civil War. I mean, there were people who were running for Congress. There were politicians who were, trying to get bills passed through Congress to accept, mediums and spiritualism as an organized religion. I mean, there was a lot of things that we don't really talk about much today. But there was a lot of anger and a lot of hatred towards spiritualism, as you might imagine. It was seen as a great threat to organized religion. Because here suddenly you had, on one side you've got, say, a priest who is, the intercession between you and God, And in this case, well, you could just talk directly to the dead, so you don't need anybody in between. Ministers, as you mentioned earlier, when we were talking about, in the Bible, it talks about, witches and how you shouldn't communicate with the dead and things. So there was a lot of that went on too. In fact, I mentioned earlier Victoria Woodhull being this woman who had run for president. A lot of the ministers at the time when she was running dubbed her Mrs. Satan. So it was, and they were posters printed, Mrs. Satan for president, so there was a lot of anger toward it. And, and today we look back at Abraham Lincoln and see this, he is a beloved figure. He's seen by the majority of Americans as probably the greatest president that we've ever had. And I think that's justified in the fact, look what this guy had to suffer through. It's no wonder that he aged the way that he did when time he was in office, middle of this terrible war of, a country divided, and he managed to steer the country most of the way through it, before his assassination. But at the time, he was hated by at least half the country because the South, burned him in effigy when he was elected president. So, there was the same kind of feelings when newspaper stories would run about these popular spiritualist mediums. A lot of people would look at that and go, oh, wow, that's great. If the president's doing it, I should do it. But a lot of people would look at it and say, see, this is what we tried to tell you about this guy. He's no good. So, yeah, it was a very divided kind of thing. And, we look back on it and we see him in one way, but at the time he was seen in a very different way by a lot of the people in the country.
Interesting. Now you touched briefly on the Fox sisters and what had occurred. Could you give our listeners who might not be familiar with that deep into the spiritualist realm, who were the Fox sisters and how did that whole part of this history develop?
Well, Kate and Maggie Fox were two young women. They were, and when I say young, I mean very young, 12 and 14 at the time that all of this started in 1848. Their family had moved into a cottage in Hydesville, New York. It was a temporary house while their father, John, built a permanent house outside of town. And so they moved into this cottage, and there had been rumors about the place for years. People had said that the house was haunted, but how much of the past history played into what happened, we don't know, because a lot of that history didn't come to light until after the events that happened. And I'll be honest with you, while I see this as a momentous event in the history of not only spiritualism, but ghost research in general, how much of it actually happened, I can't say. I wish I could, but I just don't know for a fact. But what I do know is that while the Foxes were living in this house, there were a lot of strange noises that were heard, tapping sounds, knocking sounds, and eventually the family began to feel that there might be some intelligence behind these knockings. And so Kate and Maggie decided that they would try and communicate with whatever was making these sounds occur in the house. And one night, of course, the great quote is, Mr. Splitfoot, which is kind of a jest toward, the devil, of course, who's supposed to have cloven hoofs. Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. And she knocked on the table, and the knocks came in reply. Well, they began to work out a code, and they began asking questions to this disembodied presence in the house. And eventually it was learned that it had been a peddler who had come to the house years before and who had been murdered and buried in the basement of the house. And now his ghost was there haunting the place. Now, as it happened, there was a servant woman who lived down the street who had worked for a previous family a number of years before who had lived in the house. And she just happened to remember this peddler who had come and, who just disappeared one day and left a lot of his belongings behind. And there had always been whispers as to, what had happened to the peddler? And then years later, there had been some digging that was done in the basement of the house where they found what appeared to be some human bones, which seemed to kind of, reinforce the idea that this story was true. It didn't matter. At this point, it didn't matter if the story was true or not, because when word leaked out that these two young girls were communicating with this ghost and had worked out this code to do so, people became fascinated with it. I wish I could find some. Earlier I used Pokemon Go as an example. I think it's probably bigger than that. The idea of how this swept across the country is hard for us to imagine now, because we're like, well, how did this happen? There was no internet, there was no television, all there were newspapers, and people actually would print printed books immediately, like printed booklets and broadsides that told stories of what happened at the Fox house. And then as the girls became more popular and more sought out, people began to try and find them so that they could try and duplicate what these girls were doing. Kate and Maggie had moved in with their older sister, Leah, who was a single mother who, had never really had a pretty rough life up until this point. Her husband had left her. Well, she decided, hey, this is a great way I can charge people to come and see these girls. So then, money gets involved. But people came from all over. First, they came from all over New York. Then they started coming from surrounding states. And then the girls went on tour and went around the country and met with, well, not only President Benjamin Pierce at the White House, P.T. Barnum, James Fenimore Cooper, some of the literary celebrities of the day came to see the Fox sisters and were amazed by the things that happened. Now, as time went on, questions began to be asked because from the very beginning, people began, we're questioning what was going on. The first people that started to research and to try to examine what was happening with the Fox sisters, I like to think of them as the first ghost hunters. These were the guys who they wanted to know. They didn't say that, oh, these girls were obviously frauds, but they came to it with the idea of, well, let's see, if they're doing this for real, how's it happening? How does it work? We need to see if this is real. And some people believed in what the girls were doing, others didn't. Probably the most prevalent opinion about the girls was that they were causing the rapping sounds that the ghosts would knock on things in reply to their questions, that they were doing this by popping the joints in their toes. And when they would pop the joints in the toes, they could do it in a number of raps that were, whatever the code was they had devised with the spirits. Now, this seems, when the girls would put on an
wait a minute.
Presentation. Yeah.
Okay, maybe you could crack a knuckle or two from time to time, but how do you not be able to tell the difference between and thump, thump, thump,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. And that's kind of my thought too. And so I was always very skeptical about I'm as skeptical sometimes as some of the stories that I hear about the phenomena as I am, with the explanations that these skeptics would come up with. I'm like, no one can crack their toes for an hour and a half. It just doesn't happen, but those were, but everybody had how it is, man. It's the same way today. Everybody's got an explanation for everything, and their way is the only way, and they're convinced that's how it has to be. And so they from the very beginning, they were battling critics, but the popularity of what they were doing just swept through the country in such a state that, no one was really interested in what the skeptics and usually university professors had to say. And there was a lot of politics involved even back then. And I don't mean that in a politics like government way, but in the fact that these scientists and professors were, in the 1840s and 1850s, this was seen as a time of enlightenment where people were finally getting away from, these staid beliefs in religion and, all of these fantastical things that people believed in those days. Scientists really felt like at that time they were coming along. They were really making some progress. Evolution, Darwin, all these guys were right around the same time. They were really pushing new ideas of science. And now suddenly the most popular thing in the country is talking to ghosts. So these guys were very, very unhappy with this situation. So they were going to do everything they could to discredit the idea of spiritualism and the Fox sisters and pretty much every medium that followed behind them. Because while there were plenty of frauds, man, believe me, there were lots and lots of frauds that took place during this time, and a lot of that's been documented. There were people who, to this day, can't be explained. Some of the things they did. I mean, Daniel Douglas Hume, for instance, this was a guy who he did seances. A lot of the seances were conducted just like you see in the movies, in a dark room and everything's very spooky and things. He did it in a brightly lit room, sitting in a chair in front of people. There was no, ringing bells and singing hymns and humming and everybody holding hands and around a table. He would sit in a dark room and cause things to happen. I mean, musical instruments would play on their own. Things moved about. And the one thing that he became extremely famous for, and it's going to sound completely ridiculous, you're going to say there's no way, but yet there were dozens and dozens of people who saw it, witnessed it. These were people who were politicians, literary people, newspaper editors, reporters, peers of the Crown when he was touring in England. These were people who saw it, witnessed it, and signed affidavits to say they saw this guy fly, levitate off the ground into the air. At one time, he actually flew, according to 17 witnesses, flew out the window of a room, went outside, and flew back into another window in the room.
How is this the first time I'm hearing about this guy? This is astounding.
This guy did some amazing stuff. I mean, I had to set aside a chapter in the book to say this is the stuff that is why we're so baffled by this after all these years. And he's not the only one. There were a couple of other guys too. But Hume was the one who, to this day, no one has been able to duplicate what he did. Now, Houdini, who was, as fascinated with the spirit world, was quickly, also a great debunker.
Did Hume explain what was happening? Were the spirits lifting him and carrying him out? Was he supernatural himself?
He never said. He just never said. I mean, these were just things that he did. They also said that he could make his body elongate. Like, say he's, 5'9", and then he would be able to stretch himself to like 6'5". No one could explain how. But there were scientists. I mean, Sir William Crookes, one of the guys who invented he would go on, his inventions would go on to invent radium and X-rays and that kind of thing. I mean, this guy was a genius, but he tested Hume in his laboratories and said that there was an now this is in the 1870s, keep this in mind, there was an electromagnetic field that was emanating from Hume, and that he believed that that's the cause of some of the things that he would do that would cause things to fly or to move around or to levitate, and perhaps that's how Hume was doing it too, but it was something he was creating out of his own body. But there were people from all over the world, from royalty to the commonest person, who said that they were there, they were present, and they watched Hume levitate off the ground. Now, the other side of the coin here is that how does someone levitating really communicate a message from the spirit world? It really doesn't. I mean, what's the point here? Are we doing tricks or what? But that's again, the point is that here was a guy who could do something that seems impossible to me. As far as I'm concerned, that's impossible. Right. But yet he was doing it. And he wasn't the only one. There were two brothers in Vermont, William and Horatio Eddy, who had a farm, and people would come out and stay at their farm, and they would pay a couple of bucks to stay for a week at a time, barely enough to cover they weren't really making any money off of it. So it's not like they had some kind of cash operation going. But there were these stories that were appearing in the newspaper of all these incredible things that were happening. So there was an attorney who had worked for the War Department during the Civil War investigating fraud. Now, see, I think that's an important thing. Henry Alcott was a investigator, looking for fraud in contracts during the Civil War. And he, for whatever reason, got interested in these stories he was hearing about the Eddy brothers in Vermont and decided to go out to their farm and investigate. Now, this changed his life so dramatically that he went from an attorney of an average, ordinary existence to becoming one of the founders of a theosophy movement with Madame Blavatsky. I mean, that's what he went on to. This completely turned him around. But that's not the really great part about the story is these two surly Vermont men who, didn't get along with anyone, but they were hosting these seances on their farm. And some of the seances were held in a cave on the property, which I say cave very loosely because really it was just a pile of rocks. The cave was only about 20 feet deep. So there was no place for anyone to come through tunnels. There was no hiding places, no secret rooms, or in the seance room on the second floor of their farmhouse, which Henry Alcott and a newspaper man from the New York world went out. They searched through everything. There were no trapdoors. There were no hidden cabinets, no nothing. But during seances, one of the brothers would be sitting behind a curtain, conducting the seance, communicating with the spirit world, and the spirits would appear. They would walk out of the cabinet. They would open up the curtain, walk out into the room where the spectators were, and during a 1-hour seance, there would be about 300 to 400 spirits that would appear in the room in all kinds of costumes from all over the world, speaking foreign languages.
And how were they describing these spirits? I mean,
they would talk about how they would come out. Some of them were dressed as Cossacks with these tall fur hats and military uniforms, or they would be wrapped up as Native Americans in blankets. I mean, kind of stereotypical type costumes. But the point is that these guys barely had 2 dimes to rub together. So in order to hoax this thing, they would have had to hire an entire troupe of actors outfitted with hundreds of costumes that would appear, talk to the audience, turn around, and disappear into the cabinet again. Now, when the curtains would be pulled back, of course, there would be no one there but the Eddie brother who was sitting there in the chair conjuring all this up. Now, and it wasn't just Colonel Alcott who was seeing these things. I mean, this guy was an investigator, and he was not. I mean, he's not some flake. I mean, he was the real deal, and he brought a reporter with him. And there would be people. There would be several dozen people, 30, 40 people there to witness these seances because they read about him in the newspaper. So they came up to Vermont to see what the heck was going on, and this is what they were being treated to every night. No one could explain it. I mean, I can't explain it after all this time. I mean, sure, you could look at it and say, well, all of these people must have made this up. I mean, that's the only explanation I have, but I don't believe that's the case.
Right.
So I don't know how to explain it. I mean, this is crazy stuff. It's absolutely, if something like this was, I know, if something like this was happening now, imagine the kind of coverage this would get. But this kind of stuff just doesn't happen anymore. You know,
right.
And
doesn't that make you wonder? Why is that? Why now, in this time of enlightenment, when so many people are open to this idea, you would think this is when the spirit world would just be pouring out all over us.
I know, and it's almost like they had it beaten out of them because by the end of the 19th century, so many people had been exposed as frauds that even the legitimate people who were around were afraid to do it anymore. You know, and it just kept getting worse. I mean, by the end of the World War I came along, and not so much in this country, but in England, spiritualism took another big leap, just like you were talking about earlier. Suddenly, people, you had hundreds of thousands of young men who were dead, and people realized, hey, I could communicate with them. And during the late teens and into the 1920s, spiritualism, especially in England and in Europe, took another big jump. But by the end of the 20s, I mean, by that time, science had advanced, photography had advanced, recording devices had advanced, and people began investigating and becoming so skeptical of it that people were afraid, I think honestly afraid to do it anymore. I spoke to a woman who is there are still spiritualists out there. And there's a camp in Indiana called Camp Chesterfield, and I spoke to a woman a few years ago who was someone who worked there at the camp, and I asked her, how come, why are there no seances like there used to be, with musical instruments flying around and, and all these kinds of things that you read about from the late 1800s. And she had a couple of reasons for it. I mean, she believed, like I did, that people became afraid of the criticism, that they just stopped doing it. They didn't want to open themselves up to it anymore. But she also had an idea that it might have something to do with, and this is her theory, but with our diets. Because food changed so much. By the 1920s and 1930s, things began to be pasteurized and mass-produced, and, the first frozen dinners and frozen vegetables came along at that time. And she began to believe she believed that it had something to do with our diets. And that now there are people who are mental mediums who you get messages from the other side and can communicate, but the physical mediumship of the past just isn't there anymore. People just don't manifest that kind of ability these days. I don't know if that's the case, but I thought it was an interesting theory. I mean, I thought it was an interesting idea.
It definitely is. We need to take a break, Troy. We're up against a break here. And right now, Audible.com brings you a brand new edition of Theater of the Mind. We're going to turn down the lights, light the candles, all hold hands and get a little closer.
The Seance by Philip Hoff. I got a call out of the blue from an old friend of mine last year that invited me to a seance that was going to be held with their metaphysical group. She knew I had a passing interest in the paranormal, and she had told me about many of the different experiences she had shared with her group, so even though I was skeptical of the concept, I thought it would be great fun to attend. We met at the Metaphysical Center she was a member of in Boston, and the group was polite. Everyone seemed excited by the coming events, but there was a bit of nervous tension that surrounded everyone as well. My BS meter started pinging shortly after we arrived, and we were given a set of rules for the night that included no lights, no recording devices, no speaking during the seance unless spoken to, and then the real red flag popped up when I was told we were required to keep our eyes closed until directed to open them by the trance medium. This sounded more and more like a sham to me with every passing minute. We were ushered into an empty room and set in a large circle. The room was dimly lit by tea-light candles, and we were told to sit with our feet flat on the ground, our left hand facing down, grasping the right hand of the person to our side, and their hand facing up. We were told this would create the initial connection between us all. And I have to admit, I struggled to take this seriously, and I wanted to run my mouth and wisecrack to the entire setup. Once we were set and ready, the medium entered the room silently, cloaked in a dark hooded robe, and accompanied by some hokey Gregorian chant music playing quietly in the background. He sat at the head of our circle and whispered an inaudible incantation. The smell of incense filled the air and mixed with the chant. I had to stifle a laugh at how weird this all seemed. He bowed his head, and his assistant entered the room and pulled back the hood from the medium's face. We were informed that the candles would be blown out, and soon we would be joined by the spirit guides of our host. If we were touched or greeted by the spirits, we were allowed to acknowledge them, but not break the circle and try to reach out to touch them back. One by one, the candles were blown out in a dramatic fashion. The music volume dropped, and it was no longer heard, and the room was dark. The assistant bowed to the medium and turned, walked out of the room, and shut the door, leaving us in the pitch black. The silence of the room was broken by a deep breathing and moaning of the medium. He was entering a trance state and was summoning his spirit guides. Soon the sound of the breathing faded, and I was made aware of the fact that someone was walking around the room. You could hear the heavy footfalls as it walked the outer circle of our group. Part of me was battling to control a giggle as I imagined the spirit guide leading us through a supernatural version of Duck, Duck, Goose. I regained my composure as the medium directed us to open our eyes and followed up by saying,
"We welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. Will you please aid us in communicating with the other side?"
A loud and whispery, "Yes," seemed to circle us, and I swear I could feel a brush of air against my back as something swept around the blackened room effortlessly. The next 15 minutes were filled with knocks and bangs, some of them in the middle of the room, some seeming to come from the ceiling above and the floor below. I was becoming more impressed with this showman, and I wished I could see how he was pulling off this grand hoax. All of this occurred while the medium spoke aloud, inviting spirits of our loved ones to join us and commune in our circle, which was supposed to be a circle of safety and peace. Eventually, our host brought forth some alleged spirits. Although none of us recognized the voices of the departed, he would seem to connect with someone in the room that could make some sense to the strange things being said. I wondered how desperate these people must be to make illogical connections to obvious ramblings. Once the communications began to settle, he called upon his guides again to enter the room. One he described as a large black man, very muscular and tall. He was called Ben. The other was a child, a little girl who would skip about the room and giggle from time to time, causing the hair on my arm and neck to stand on end. Her name was Carolyn. We were told we could ask questions and they would come to us and make contact. I heard women around the room gasp as Carolyn would skip past them, bumping their legs as she made her way around the room. I knew this was my chance to unmask this fraud. As weird and as creepy as it was at times, I still knew there was a trick, so I waited. as I heard her giggle and approach, and the women to my right laugh or squeal in delight, I would take and stretch out my legs in front of me so that as Carolyn sped by, she certainly would trip over my legs. And the proof would be right there for all of us to see. Proof that this was nothing but a scam. As she closed in, I held steady, preparing to feel her slam right into my legs. But then suddenly, my chair jumped, as it felt like someone very big, kicked my chair from behind, causing me to almost fall out of my chair. "What the hell?" I yelled out. The girl continued her merry jaunt around the room and never once brushed against my legs. I was shaken by what had just happened and wanted out of the room. This is when I felt two huge hands forcefully grab my shoulders and force me hard down into my chair. Then I felt the hot breath on my neck and ear, and an angry, loud, whispery voice chirped in my ear.
You like playing games? How about Duck, Duck, Goose? Or do you just like tripping little girls?
My heart was racing, and the medium spoke directly to my antagonizing guest.
Ben, leave him alone. He is not a believer.
That is when booming laughter filled the room, and my chair leapt again as though someone kicked it hard from behind. The dark, whispery voice cried out again, this time in a playful, laughing tone.
He may have come in here not believing. I bet he's believing real good right now.
I offered an apology and felt the women to either side of me grip my hands even tighter, as Ben seemed to walk off toward the medium after giving me the final boot and speaking out loud. The medium said he was closing the session and we would be entering the realm of the light once again, but just before he finished, I felt the big heavy hands push down on my thighs, and what happened next I cannot explain, but from the darkness, I saw a face appear right in front of me, a big, smiling face of a large, bald black man. And before he let go, he hissed,
See you again, real soon.
And with that, the door to the room creaked open, and the medium's assistant entered, bringing with him light. My eyes blinked hard against the harsh light, and I scanned the room looking for my scary adversary. To my astonishment, the room was completely empty of anyone besides our group and the medium and his assistant. I approached the medium to apologize for my actions and asked what Ben meant by he would see me real soon. The medium just smiled, nodded, and said,
Oh, you will find out.
I'd be a liar if I didn't admit that scared the hell out of me ever since the interaction. Sometimes I just lay awake at night and pray I never face Ben or Carolyn ever again.
Beyond the darkness.
We're back. We've got Troy Taylor as our guest this evening, and the American Hauntings book. We're talking about the rise of the spirit world and the birth of the modern ghost hunter. We have so much to cover. This time's flying by. I'm already just blown away by what we've talked about here. You mentioned that Lincoln was not the first to do seances. That was news to me. I always thought the Lincoln family was what kind of brought it in. Who else involved themselves with the spiritualist movement?
Well, Benjamin Pierce actually was the first president to bring mediums into the White House, and it was the Fox sisters. The sad, really tragic story of the Pierce family was that on the way to his inauguration, when they left and were on their way to Washington, they were in a railroad crash on the way, and their son was killed. Elizabeth Pierce's wife. Their young son was killed during the accident, and his wife really never recovered. She was the rest of her life was spent in mourning, and so they had a few very sad years in the White House. And one of the things that the president did was to bring in the Fox sisters to try to communicate with their dead son. No details of it were ever released, so we don't know exactly what happened when they were there at the White House, but for whatever reason, he did bring them in. They had a private meeting with the president and his wife, and that became the first seance in the White House. And it was, of course, Lincoln that made it so popular. Right. But he wasn't, and then that wasn't the last. There were plenty of Florence Harding became very well known for having seances in the White House. And her husband, of course, died under what some feel are mysterious circumstances. But while he was still alive in the 1920s, he was kind of allowed her to do whatever she liked. And she was having mediums brought into the White House to hold seances, which infuriated Harry Houdini, the magician. I mentioned earlier he was fascinated with the spirit world, but he was also a great debunker of a lot of the mediums at the time. And I think really Houdini kind of brought an end to the popularity of spiritualism, and really it was the very public feud that he had with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who was a great proponent of spiritualism. The two were very good friends, but had a very strong antagonism toward each other over spiritualism. And Houdini was just infuriated that Florence Harding was bringing mediums into the White House. And in fact, he appeared before Congress to give testimony about how mediums should be outlawed in Washington, D.C. It was a publicity stunt. I mean, everything Houdini did was a publicity stunt. But he showed up to speak before Congress about spiritualism and mediums and fortune tellers. And one of the things he, made a point of mentioning was the fact that, Mrs. Harding was bringing in mediums. So he was very upset about this. So, it's one of those things that has been, mixed into the American culture.
Right. I
mean, it's part of our culture, and it has really shaped popular culture in the United States. I mean, that's one of the things that I've written about spiritualism quite a bit over the years, but I never really got too far beyond that, the spiritualist movement and the end of the movement with Houdini and his big feud, and then of course his death and the seances and things that followed. Because after that, people didn't talk about ghosts for quite a while. For probably a couple of decades, most of the stuff that you saw as far as the paranormal went, had to do with, the first time people became interested in reincarnation and astrology, and Edgar Cayce became very popular in the 1930s. But I mean, people had a lot on their plate.
Right.
This is the middle of the Great Depression. Nobody really cared much about ghosts.
Sure.
That didn't kind of start bouncing back until the 50s. And then when, Hans Holzer came into the field and started to put out some of his books and do some of his stuff.
Well, that's an interesting
interest
point.
Began to rise. Yeah.
Looking at Hans Holzer and D. Scott Rogo and some of the people like that were involved, who was actually the first true American ghost hunters?
Really, Hans Holzer, was an immigrant, but still an American, obviously,
right,
and became popular here in the United States. And he really was among the first as far as the ghost hunters went. Because again, a lot of the stuff at the time was, J.B. Rhine was, involved in ESP testing and stuff. People had just kind of had enough of ghosts. After spiritualism sort of petered out, people just weren't doing it. So it really wasn't until Holzer came along and started to make it popular again. And then, in the 60s and 70s, there were things that popped up here and there in the 60s and the early 70s. But a lot of that had to do with a lot of our, again, following the culture of the paranormal in America. A lot of it was very occult-based. That's when witchcraft became so popular, and Wicca and that kind of thing in the 60s. And, of course, you had Anton LaVey and his various stunts that really put Satanism and exorcisms and possession and all that into the field, and with The Exorcist and all that. It's, people don't realize what an effect the paranormal has had on our culture. And then, of course, when you get into the late 70s, of course, what do you have? What's the one thing you think of? Amityville. And that's what turned everything around. I mean, that's what really, Amityville was the Fox Sisters of the 1970s. I mean, that's what captured the attention of the entire country, was that one story. And that's really was a turning point leading up to what we know now. I mean, it was one thing after another from Amityville era up until, Ghostbusters. And then you had, which, you and I joked about that earlier, but that was a very important cultural touchstone of the paranormal, was it got people interested in ghosts again. It's silly. It was a comedy. It was a lot of fun. But that's it. But it really, when Lloyd Auerbach put out his ESP Hauntings and Poltergeist book in 1984, he did that right on the rise that ghost hunters or Ghostbusters, created, and it became popular. A lot of that stuff came along at that time, and then you got into the X-Files in the 90s, and then, of course, then the television stuff started. And I don't mean, 2004 when you're talking about ghost hunters. I'm talking about sightings and some of that stuff that came along in the, in the early 90s before there were ever any kind of reality TV shows. So, but it all rides a wave of culture. We talked about the wars, and those were cultural touchstones of the time. The Civil War, then you had the World War I, and you had these terrible traumatic events that happened. But then it became more of, it became about whatever it was that was popular in the news or in movies or later television or books or whatever. And you see a rise, you see a change in the paranormal world, so it's all a part of our cultural history, which is, what I think fascinated me about this topic in the first place, and which what led to the book.
I'm just curious, what is your thoughts on Amityville?
Well, I devote an entire chapter to all of it, Amityville and everything that comes with it. I think that, well, for one thing, let me start off by saying that it's certainly possible that a house where events that happen there, it certainly could become haunted. I mean, this was a guy who murders his entire family inside this house in 15 minutes. So it definitely had a traumatic event that could have left a haunting, and I think it may have. I mean, I think that there may have been some residual activity that followed those murders. I mean, you got to remember the Lutz family moved into that house a year after it happened. I mean, they left a year after it happened. I mean, it was just not. It was something that was so fresh and so, could have left a terrible impression on that place. And I think it probably did. I think there probably was a haunting there, but I don't think it was anything like what showed up in the book. There are just too many problems with the story. I mean, there were just too many things that didn't happen, that were reported, say, in the pages of the book. And I think what more than anything, it was a story that got out of control. I mean, we've heard from, you take all the elements, and you've heard from the attorney for Ronnie DeFeo, who said, I wanted to try to get my client a new trial. I sat down with the Lutzes. We cooked up this idea of, they talk about the house being haunted. So we, turned it into he was possessed by a demon and the devil made him do it. So he's crazy. Obviously he's crazy, right? So I can get him a new trial. I mean, that's what he claimed. That's what the attorney claimed. The Lutzes later on said, well, some of it was exaggerated. Well, they put that story in the hands of a writer they didn't really know, who had taken, all of the testimony and things that they said, about what happened there in the house, and they put it in his hands, and he created a story out of it. He created a narrative, and the narrative was embellished and over the top and ripe for a movie deal. And, it was all there. All the elements were there, and it became this tremendous success. And at that point, I think this runaway train it had gone too far, and nobody knew how to get off of it. And I think it just spiraled out of control. I really do. And I don't know that I point fingers at anyone in particular. I just think things got out of hand. And this became a huge story, and nobody knew how to make it stop. And I think that there may have been something that happened there, but everyone who has lived in the house says that it is not haunted since that time. And a lot of the things that were reported in the book from the priest who came to the house who said he was never there and sued the Lutzes for claiming that he was, and, on and on and on. That's really what I think. I think it was an embellishment that got out of control, and, it was never that big of a deal, but what do you do? I think that they just lost control of it. That's my opinion anyway. So.
Right. And I follow that. And, I'm friends with Chris Lutz, the youngest boy from the Amityville house. And, we've spoken about it. And he even says that a lot of it was way blown out when he read that book. He said it was kind of a mockery of his own life. Yeah, that
Right.
very little made any sense, and especially the fact that George was kind of the hero. He believes that George brought on what took place there, and the reason that nothing happened afterwards was because it was around him.
Yeah.
No, that's his brother, Daniel.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a fascinating aspect of our history. All right, let's, with all the topics, I mean, you've got a lot of stuff crammed into this book and a lot of great information, a lot of history. What were some of the things that even surprised you as you dug in to find the things you wanted to cover for this book?
Well, some of the stuff with it, especially some of the early stuff, when you're talking about, I went over some of the stuff about the Eddy brothers, and I talked about some of the stuff with some of these early mediums, but a lot of it, as I dug deeper, I mean, some of it I covered before, but as I dug deeper, I kept finding, how, I laugh at some of it. I go, yeah, come on now, these, phantom hands that fly around and grab people and stuff, in a seance, and I'm thinking there's no way. But then you read the rest of the description from an eyewitness who was there and said, this happened in a fully lit room. There was no way anyone could have tricked this. I mean, there were no strings, there were no anything. And I think, how did these things even happen? I don't even understand it. I'm just baffled by some of it, because my first inclination is to be skeptical of a lot of it, because there were just so many frauds. And, of course, here I'm playing into the idea of what killed off the movement in the first place was people stopping believing in what could possibly happen. And that's how I came into a lot of it. And, there were plenty of stories that, of outright blatant frauds, but then there were plenty of stories that, man, they just left me scratching my head, entire families that would hold these seances and people would come from miles around to see what was going on inside their seance room and would leave saying they saw musical instruments flying around and tapping them on top of the head. I mean, there were no special effects in those days. There were a handful of stage musicians around who just weren't that good. So how did they? If all this stuff was fake, how did they convince so many people that it was real? I mean, how did so many people around the country become committed to the idea that people were talking to the dead? When nothing like that, it was completely foreign to the American senses at the time. We just didn't have anything like that in this country. It just didn't exist. I mean, yeah, there was a history of ghost stories. I mean, everybody who came here from a foreign country, who came from Europe or came from England, there were ghost stories, sure, but there were never stories about sitting around, an ordinary person sitting in their dining room at the table and having their dead aunt communicate with them through a planchette or a talking board. This was completely foreign to anything of our sensibilities.
Right.
And so when you read these firsthand accounts of some of these things that happened, these people are just completely flummoxed by what was going on. And you share that when you start doing this research and you're like, yeah, I can't explain it either.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I can sit here and tell you 50 reasons why the message you get from a Ouija board is probably just muscle impulse or something in the back of your brain. I can give you lots of explanations, but when you're sitting there and you're experiencing it and you've never experienced anything like that before in your life, those explanations don't mean anything to you. Because as far as you're concerned, this is a real experience, and it is a real experience.
Right.
Maybe there's an explanation for it, but what is it? Well, who knows?
Well,
when you're getting a message,
right, it becomes very real to you.
Right.
On
Exactly.
the show we just covered, Dr. Robert Arp with us talking about kind of the X-Files and the philosophy side of it, and he states up front that he has no faith in the paranormal or ghosts or anything like that. And as the interview progressed, he was very adamant about the fact that science just won't waste their time and never really looked into this because it was flight of fancy. But, I mean, scientists did have an interest in this.
Yeah, that's not accurate, because there were lots of scientists, who got into it. The
and
ones who
what did they make of it?
look into it.
Yeah, did they come up with conclusions on what happens to us after we die, or was it all based on faith?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. These guys, that was something I mentioned earlier. They were angry about the fact that people were believing this stuff because they were convinced they had a scientific reason for everything. And the ones who refused to acknowledge it or believe it or just said it was a flight of fancy, these guys were the ones who never attended a seance. They just dismissed it completely because if they didn't believe it, it couldn't be true. That was kind of their thought behind it, But there were enough scientists who, went to a seance or had heard about it and were curious because not necessarily even sometimes because they believed that it was a communication with the dead. They were curious about the electrical side of it or the chemical side of it. When William Crookes investigated Daniel Hume, it wasn't because he believed he had messages from the other side. He believed that there was some sort of magnetic energy coming through this guy that was causing these things to happen. Now, he later went on to become a solid believer in the spirit world, but not at first. And that was the way with a lot of the scientists that studied this stuff, because the very first ghost hunters, the very first ghost hunting group, so to speak, that ever formed was a Society for Psychical Research in England. Now, spiritualism and all this stuff started in this country, but for whatever reason, the first real dedicated group of ghost hunters started in England, and they were all scientists. I mean, all of them. They were either scientists or somehow involved in, some sort of critical thinking or psychology or philosophy. These were not just guys off the street who decided to buy matching black T-shirts and go out and look for ghosts. These were eminent scientists of the day because they wanted to know if there was some truth to it. And most of them studied it for the rest of their lives. I mean, they spent decades delving into this stuff and writing and researching and writing papers on it. Some things they believed, some things they didn't. Some of the stuff is so dry that it's almost impossible to read because there's so much depth and detail about the mediums they tested and the times they would put them to a test with unknown people and seance after seance after seance. Leonora Piper was a young woman from America who was studied by William James, the philosopher in the United States, but also she went over to England to study with the SPR. And they put her through years and years of testing. And by the time they were finished, James said about her, he said that she, you don't have to prove that every crow is black. There could be one that's white, and she was his white crow. She was the one oddity that stood out to him among all of the other mediums that he tested. He couldn't explain what she'd done. He couldn't explain the things that she came up with, the messages that she received from the other side. And these were guys who were, they were the reason that we have the science field today because they were doing the early stuff. And then people built on to what they had done into, the nuclear program. All of the stuff came from what these guys had been doing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So all scientists don't dismiss the paranormal. That's not accurate. So
what do you had a story I know in the press release that mentions this poltergeist in Columbus, Ohio back in the 80s. And I seem to recall that story. And but it's far deep in my memory banks. Refresh us on this. What was this story?
Yeah.
Where did it happen?
Yeah, it became a big deal too. It made the newspapers because it went on for a number of days, and there were a lot of reporters involved, and they were carrying the story. But there was a young woman whose name was Tina Resch, and she lived in Columbus, and this was in '84. So you and I would have been in high school at the time, and that's when I remember seeing some stories about it in the newspaper and got interested in following the story. And by the time it really made a lot of the newspapers, it was over, because with most poltergeist outbreaks, they don't last for very long. And this was a particular case. This young woman was a fairly troubled young woman, as is often the case with poltergeists. And there was all kinds of activity that was taking place in the home of the family. She was a foster child who lived with the Resch family and had been adopted by them. And she had had a lot of issues in school. She'd had some problems with some friends. She was just a troubled young woman. But when the activity began, it was, lights turning on and off, things flying across the room, shattering. I think every glass in the house was broken. This was the 80s. I mean, they didn't know what to do. You don't know who do you call, They called the police. The police came out and investigated, didn't know what to say. Eventually they turned to the press. Reporters showed up, and they were kind of following the story from the Columbus paper. And they, actually the reporter and a photographer witnessed a lot of the activity in the house. I mean, they would leave the room. The room would be empty, and there would be glasses shattering against the wall. Eggs were flying out of the refrigerator. Everything was flying out of the refrigerator. But the big story became when, furniture was moving around and that kind of thing, but they were sitting in the living room, and Tina, was sitting in a chair across the room from the photographer, and he kept trying to take a picture of her because there was a telephone that sat next to the couch that kept flying across the room. And he kept trying to photograph it, but every time he tried, he couldn't get it. So what he did was aim the camera, and this is, back in the days before digital. He aimed the camera and started taking pictures and didn't pay any attention. He was looking the other way. And when he did, the phone flew across the room. And there was a great picture, a great color picture that was in newspapers across the country that I reproduced in the book. And it was this telephone in midair flying across her lap. She's got her hands up in the air, startled look on her face, and there's a flying telephone. And that's what really spread across the country. The AP Wire picked it up, and people started talking about this poltergeist story. Dr. William Roll got involved in it. He was asked to come in. One of the newspaper reporters had done a story on him. He was working at Duke, I believe at the time, and had done a story on him a year or so before, so he contacted and asked him to come up. Dr. Roll witnessed quite a bit of it, but he got there at kind of the tail end of the outbreak. And at that point, people started to, activity started to die down. It had gotten a lot of attention. And in a lot of these cases, especially like this one, this was a young girl who had a lot of problems, had a lot of trouble, and needed a lot of attention. Well, suddenly she had it. She had all kinds of attention, more attention than she knew what to do with. And as she started to feel more satisfied with herself, so to speak, the activity dropped off because with most poltergeist cases, they usually, have something to do with energy discharge from usually troubled young people seems to be the main thing, but it can be adults as well. And so all of this activity that was sort of surrounding her suddenly started to drop off. And of course, as often happens in many of these cases, she started to fake a few things. Dr. Roll caught her in the act a few times, and, that was sort of the end of it. He took her down to Duke, and she went through some testing and that kind of thing. But by then, the outbreak was over. Now, sadly, though, she went on to lead a very troubled and traumatic life. Eventually, she had a daughter who was murdered by a boyfriend, and Tina, because she was there at the time, ended up, and she's still in prison in Georgia today. So her troubled life didn't end with the poltergeist outbreak, but that was a big story, and was a huge story in the 80s, one of the biggest stories around. And again, it fit into the culture, the popular culture of the time, and that's what got people's attention, and the field just kept growing.
Why is Tina in prison? What happened with her?
Well, there was a murder. Her child was killed. And the murder was actually committed by her boyfriend, her live-in boyfriend. But because she was there as well and was involved, she got kind of an accomplice rap, connected to it. And she ended up in prison too, because of the association with the murder. So it's fairly complicated, but wow. Yeah, she's unfortunately in jail today. So still in jail. So there was a great book that was put out a couple of years ago. I want to say it was called Unleashed. And it really delves into the really details of the story and what happened to her afterward. And has a lot of information from Dr. Roll, who I believe passed away a couple of years ago. But it's a really great book. I mean, I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in that case. So, yeah, I mean, he was involved in it, and then he had a co-author when writing that book. So, look it up. It's good.
Where do you think we stand now? I mean, with the popularity of the paranormal, maybe at one of the highest points it's ever been. You know, every TV network has had some version of a paranormal show on. Do you think we're getting closer to really proving anything, or have we hit a plateau that we really haven't moved past even since the 1800s?
Well, I think we've gone beyond what we knew in the 1800s, or the turn of the last century, or into the 1920s and 30s. But I think right now, I mean, people ask me, well, where are we now? And I said, well, this is sort of we're in a new chapter right now. This is a chapter that is kind of still unwritten. Because once you get into the 21st century, we delved into new territory. I mean, this is the next chapter in the story of the paranormal. Once the internet and television, this is the chapter we're in right now. So we're going to get beyond this chapter. Now, what's beyond it, I don't know. I really don't. I think that things got really exciting in the mid 90s when everybody got the internet. When it became a household thing that pretty much anyone could get online. Now, we didn't have, the smartphones and tablets and that kind of stuff that we had, but, we all had, or not all, but a lot of people had, their home computers or their office computers. And that was our next chapter. That was the beginning of what was next. I mean, I think the internet is what gave birth to the reality TV shows that we know now. And reality TV, we all owe that to Cops. Because that was really the first reality TV show.
Right.
It had nothing to do with the paranormal, but people began to realize how easy this was to create something like this. So, I think that right now, I don't know. I mean, we're in this section, we're in this chapter, this period of the paranormal where, the internet isn't the main thing now. It seems to be television, and we're going to move beyond this into something else. But I don't know what that is yet. I mean, I think it's still out there, and it's still going to be a few years. It's going to be another 5-10 years before we see what's going to be the next thing. But I think that at some point we're going to see, some new equipment that becomes, and it can't be just like one gadget that one guy invents. It's got to be something that is going to become universal, like the internet became, or like television shows that we all have access to now. It's going to be something that we all can get access to because that's part of our popular culture. So I don't know what's next, but something's coming. There will be something coming. I just don't know what it is. We're just going to beyond just TV shows. It's going to be something else. So I guess we'll see. I don't know.
You've had a chance to investigate many different locations and many different histories. What place, in your opinion, is truly a location that you would consider haunted?
Oh, boy. There's been a lot. I mean, I've been to a lot of places that I really feel have something there. I mean, that something left behind, something. And, there's so many different variables that go into making a haunting. I feel that the Moore House in Villisca, Iowa, where these murders took place, that has been a story I've been fascinated with for years. And, I had an experience there, nothing earth-shaking, but enough to convince me that there's something to it. And things I've seen there, I really feel there's something left behind. I mean, there's been plenty of places, the Lint Mansion in St. Louis. I mean, I had experiences there. The one place that I have to say that I actually left, I mean, I didn't run screaming from the place, but I did leave, and I wouldn't stay there by myself, was the Bell Witch Cave in Tennessee. And that story, I mean, you're talking about a 200-year-old story about, the spirit that plagued, I mean, most people know the story, but the spirit that plagued the John Bell family and disappeared. And, legend always had it that it went into this cave. And I don't know if that's if that's accurate or if it's backward, if the spirit came out of the cave, because the cave is located directly beneath an Indian burial ground that was disturbed. And I've got a whole long theory that I could go on for an hour about. But I do think there's something to that place. But that's been the one place where not only have I had experiences, but that's the one place that I was in there, and this has been years ago, and I was in there and had the chance I could stay as long as I wanted to by myself, nobody else in the cave, and I didn't do it. I couldn't do it. And that's not normal for me. I mean, I'm as psychic as a doorknob. I do not have I am not in any way have any kind of psychic abilities that I'm aware of. But yet, for whatever reason, that's the one place that scared me too badly to stay. So, I mean, I think there's lots of places that are haunted, that are realistically haunted. A lot of places that are completely overblown, that are not any way that shapes up to the legend that surrounds them. But there are plenty that are, and that's the one that scared me. I have to say, that is the one that scared me.
Do you think that, when we look back at history, we see that even some of the greatest minds like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla had an interest in this and the possibility of communicating and trying to figure out that if we exist outside of our physical form as an energy, how to recognize that energy signature and communicate back and forth with it. Are there any tools, anything out there that you feel is close to that right now or may be bringing us closer to communication?
Well, I think that may be, when I was talking about that may be the next thing. I think that might be the next thing. And I know we're talking about something that, for 100 years people have been talking about a device, that actually, communicates that isn't, I don't know. I mean, I've seen a lot of devices that with real-time recording and voice playback and, a lot of gibberish and spinning radio dials and a lot of, people making messages out of something that aren't. And I'm not saying that it's in every case, but I've seen that a lot, in the study of all this. I think that it totally makes sense because, what is a ghost? It's just energy. It's a personality of somebody who died and their personality is still there. Science will tell you that personalities don't exist, but we know they do. Every single person is completely different than the other, even though we're the same physical makeup. We're water, bone, blood, and gristle. And yet there's a charge there, and that's got to go somewhere. You make it sound so
sexy, Troy.
I know, right? So, we're a bag of meat and bones, right?
Right.
But we're charged up by something, and you can't put your finger on it. You can't bottle it. You can't capture it, but it's there. So science will tell you that can't exist because they can't take that out of you and bottle it up and make it and reproduce it and make it happen over and over again. So if it can't be replicated, it can't be real. But we know that that's not true. We know that each person is different and that energy has to go somewhere because even the greatest minds tell us that, energy never really dies. It just has to go somewhere else. So it's there somewhere. And that was kind of Edison's thought behind it when he started talking about, if all that energy is out there somewhere, how come, we should be able to tap into it? He'd never figured out how. But, somebody may figure out how. And I think maybe that's going to be the next big thing. And when it does, it's not going to be one of those things that, there's always going to be somebody who disputes it or questions it. That's the nature of the world. But I think it will be more easy for people to relate to and to understand than what we have now. Because there are a lot of devices that people have been building and putting out there, and all of them have their flaws, and some of them are great, some of them are not so great, but it's nothing that's gonna become mainstream. But maybe this next thing will. Maybe that's where we're going next. We're going to move beyond Ouija boards. We've already moved beyond tapping on the table and tapping on the walls, and we moved past Ouija boards, and we moved into mediums, and we kind of moved past that. So, something else has got to be next. So I guess we'll see, but I like the idea of it. I think you're right that there's energy out there. We just have to find a way to reach it.
You've got something pretty impressive happening here in June. Your 21st annual event is returning to Alton, Illinois. Why don't you tell people what's going on and how they can come?
Oh, yeah. It's our 21st Haunted America Conference. We've been doing it since 1997, and this is we did it in Alton for a number of years, and then we've kind of come back. We've got a great venue for it, a great location. We thought last year it was our 20th anniversary, and it was a big deal, and we thought, how are we going to top this? And now we already have. So but we do still have some spots left. I mean, if people are interested in coming, the discount price runs until June 18th, I believe. So it's going to be down to the wire. But we've got speakers coming in, we've got authors, we've got workshops, we've got tours, we've got ghost hunts. The whole town kind of gets involved. Alton's not a real big place, but it's one of the most haunted small towns in America. So the Visitors Bureau motto goes, and I think it's accurate. And it's a blast. It's a lot of fun. I mean, it's something I look forward to every year because it's the one place you can go where you're not a complete weirdo, a complete freak, because everyone else is there for the same reason you are. So if you're there because you believe in ghosts or fairies or goblins or who knows what, I mean, probably there's 20 other people there at least who have the same odd belief that you do. So it's a lot of fun. I mean, I get to see a lot of people I only get to see once a year, and that I think makes it really special for a lot of people. People think of it as kind of, old home reunion week. So it's a lot of fun, and it's the one thing we look forward to every single year.
Ghostconference.net. Ghostconference.net if you want to get tickets. And folks, I'm going to prepare you for it. You're used to paying $150, $200, $300, $400 for a weekend. Troy Taylor's going to put you down, man. He's going to really sock it to you with a whole $50.
Yeah, it's the same price we charged in 1997, and I've never raised it. So
$50, yeah. And then there's after hours events and ghost hunts that are kind of a la carte, so you can sign up for other things to do as well while you're out there. But you couldn't spend $50 in a better way. I hope you guys will check it out. And if this book isn't your cup of tea, don't worry. He's got, another 121 books out there that they can choose from?
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. How many books do you have?
No, I know. You're right. No, it's 122 as of next week. So
122
yeah, you're
books.
right.
All right, so check it out. Troy, we'll have links up to your site and for the conference as well so people can find you. It's great catching up, and please, let's not make it another 10 years.
No way. This is great. I appreciate it. So it's fun. Good to talk to you.
We'll look forward to talking to you again soon. And that's it for this week, kids. Remember, I'm hosting Coast to Coast AM tonight, the best in overnight talk radio, and tomorrow, Saturday. So you can tune in and find stations in your areas and ways to listen by visiting coasttocoastam.com. Or you can always stream it right from our home studios at knsiradio.com. That's knsiradio.com. We'll be back next week. Timmy D will be back with me for Supernatural News and Parashare. Thank you. Be kind and loving this weekend. And we'll talk to you again right here on the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.